Weird Tales Told by a Dubliner by Turlough Conmee. Story number 13. Last night. Last flight. It was in the summer of 2018 that the disaster of the Junkers 52 happened in the Swiss Alps. There was a company called Air that operated a fleet of some of the last Ju-52s made by the Junkers Aircraft Company. These were nicknamed Tante Jus or Auntie Jus, and they were operated for years as a tourist attraction out of the old Air Force base at Dubliner. These were some of the three-engined aircraft that Switzerland had acquired from Nazi Germany for use as weather reconnaissance planes on the eve of the Second World War. After the war, a company called Air had bought and repaired a number of them for tourist trips in the Alps. It had become a tradition among old aircraft enthusiasts to travel on one of these. They had been photographed, filmed, and used in adventure movies. I wanted to go on one myself for a day trip to celebrate me 65th birthday, which was to be that year in 2018. I had really been looking forward to taking such a trip. But it never happened. I delayed booking the flight, and then the chief plane was chartered by a group who wanted to go on a trip south to Lugano and back. They flew down at the beginning of a weekend and spent the time there in Ticino. For several days, the plane was sitting on the tarmac in the hot summer sun in Lugano, its tanks full of fuel. At the end of the weekend, they flew back. They only got as far as Pizzegnas in the Grisons Alps. This is a tall mountain that features a spiky ridge at the top. It seems like the pilots wanted to show this sight to the passengers. Whatever went wrong, they crashed. The plane hit the side of the mountain before it could emerge over the top of the ridge. A gust of wind caught it and sent it down below the peak again. The fuselage was completely destroyed, and the 17 passengers and 3 crew all killed. It took a while for the Swiss authorities to get a helicopter up there to start recovering the bodies. The shock was great and was felt around the country. Everyone wanted to know what had gone wrong. At first there was a great deal of speculation about the fuel in the tanks, whether it had leaked or evaporated and maybe caused the motors to cut out just as they were trying to cross Pizzegnas. But no, when the official accident report emerged, the blame was placed on the 2 pilots. It seems they had been cowboys, taking a risk they shouldn't have taken. They flew up the side of Pizzegnas and attempted to cross the ridge, but they were caught by a downwind that blew the plane back and sent them into a tailspin that caused them to crash further down the slope. I was personally affected by what happened because I might just as easily have been aboard and been killed. As it happens, a friend of mine, Nick Boudreau, and his wife Dagmar were on a trip to Switzerland at the time. They lived in the centre of British Columbia, where he ran a local flying company that served the tourist trade and mining companies in the area. Dagmar had grown up in Laufen near Basel as the daughter of a German woman. She had gone to school and been taught by my partner Elizabeth at the local high school. There, she had learned English. After finishing school, she had been on a trip to British Columbia, where she met Nick. He was married to somebody else at the time, but he had left her for Dagmar. She had later helped him with the business side of flying his local small planes. She had herself set up a horse breeding business where they lived in the interior of BC. Now they were on a trip together, visiting her mother in Switzerland. The spectacular crash of the Ju-52 had happened and made all the headlines while Nick and Dagmar were in Switzerland. Now, being a pilot, Nick couldn't fail to be interested in what had happened. I remember we met and discussed the matter several times. It took a while for the reasons to emerge, and I remember us both being shocked by what we heard. He because of the circumstances of the accident, me because I might have been on board. "You never know what may happen," Nick said. Then our conversation went on to my personal ambition to go on a last trip to mark my retirement. I explained to him that I wanted to go on a trip, and now my desires were focusing on a last journey along the west coast of BC to look at birds and nature. I had lived over there more than 20 years before, and all my memories of youth were wrapped up in the west coast. I felt like doing this while I still could. Nick was very sympathetic here. He offered to pilot me along the coast in a seaplane, assuming he could borrow one from the company he worked for. We agreed we would do this. It would be kind of a farewell trip for him too. So we scheduled it for February 2019, the start of spring on the west coast, when we both still felt up to doing it. I flew from Zurich to Vancouver in February 2019 and took the big ferry from there to Vancouver Island the following day. It was a familiar sight passing through the islands, Maine and Galliano, on the way to Victoria. It was just a little cool, but it was already spring. Then I arrived in Victoria and met Nick Boudreau. We had dinner together, and our talk was inevitably of the Tante Ju that had crashed the previous summer in the Swiss Alps. The safety report had emerged in the meantime. It was a shock to find that the leak of fuel had turned out to be nothing but a red herring, and the blame now rested on the two deceased pilots. After a few days seeing the old sights in Victoria, Nick took me down to look at the small seaplane he had borrowed from his company with a view to flying it up the coast. It was a neat de Havilland twin-otter plane with two floats under the engines on the wings. As well as the two co-pilots, it had room for about 4 passengers. It was parked at a wharf on Victoria Harbour that was often used by Nick's company and other such outfits transporting people for business or pleasure to the island or up the coast. He would be pilot, and I had acquired enough training in the meantime to function as his co-pilot. At least, he said he'd let me do a few things under his supervision. "What do you think of it?" he asked. It seemed to me a neat little plane, and we'd certainly have plenty of room for the two of us, and for the equipment we were bringing with us: telescopes, binoculars, cameras, lenses, and ornithological guidebooks. There were plenty of towns up the coast of Vancouver Island, and then the northern coast of BC and Alaska, for us to refuel for the onward journey. I nodded and smiled. "It's a fine plane," I said. "Nick, just the kind of thing I'd expect you to fly." Nick announced that we would be leaving Victoria Harbour the following morning, not long after dawn, at about 8:30. I promptly agreed. "You always were an early riser," I said, and made arrangements with him to get me stuff on board in the course of the day. The next morning we met down on the wharf just after dawn, and we were flying out of Victoria Harbour by 8:30. I heard the familiar deep stroke of the Havilland twin engines as we travelled across the open harbour to the Laurel Point Inn, a hotel and resort built at the mouth of the harbour, passing it by and then taking off into the sky just outside the harbour, where there was an assortment of ocean-going ships lying at anchor in the early light of dawn. We sped into the air up over Victoria Harbour, and we were on our way. It was just like old times. For me, there was nothing more evocative of West Coast living than the sound of one of them seaplanes either arriving at or leaving from Victoria Harbour. In fact, the two sounds that did it for me were that seaplane engine in the distance and the sound of a BC ferry whistle from an approaching ship among the islands. It was all coming back to me now. 20 years of West Coast living. We went off up the coast, and our first stop was Whitty's Lagoon. This is a place on the south coast of the island. We saw herdons on the rocks looking out to sea. Then, looking down through the forest, we saw a belted kingfisher down below on the water, perching on a wooden stump in the lagoon itself. I admired the tufted head on the stocky bird. Tramping over to the sandy beach to enjoy some coffee and breakfast, we admired several bald eagles flying around just out to sea. They emerged black and white out of the mist that hung over the Pacific. Then we travelled on up the Inside Passage and stayed the night in Parksville. During the following morning, we walked out across the long beach where the tide was out and enjoyed the view across the passage to the coast on the opposite side. It always seemed to me that the bric-a-brac that was left by the outgoing tide each morning was the text it had written on the miles of open sand. We heard the strident calls of a flock of black oyster catchers as they flew along the shoreline. Then we spent the day flying over to the other side of Vancouver Island. It was wonderful to fly along the coast, just on the edge of the ocean, where there was nothing between you and the open Pacific, between you and Japan. We flew along the West Coast Trail, stopped at a little bay, and got out and walked in the invigorating sea breeze, watching the moors, cormorants and flocks of gulls offshore. We flew back and spent the night in Tofino. On the following morning, admired the artwork in the shops, masks, pictures, blankets, and so on. Nick remarked to me that he had been having strange visions while we were travelling up the coast. He'd seen a phantom of the Tante Ju that crashed in the Alps the summer before. A few times when he looked back from the cockpit into the seaplane, he told me, he seemed to be looking into the body of a Tante Ju with the characteristic single line of seats along the portholes. I couldn't explain it myself, and he just shrugged it off. Then we flew the plane across the island to Port Hardy on the far side and got tickets for a commercial passenger plane going up to Prince Rupert. It was not the last glimpse we got that reminded us of the old Tante Ju that had crashed. When we got on board, we exchanged helpless, worried glances. In front of us was a single line of seats along the portholes on one side. It was just like the seating in a Tante Ju. Eventually, we just shrugged our shoulders and sat down in the line of single seats. The plane took off and we headed for Prince Rupert. When we got to Prince Rupert, it was still in the forenoon, and we were able to reclaim the same kind of seaplane we had been flying. We flew above the waves, and it was a sparkling spring morning where the sun shone on the... It took about 20 minutes for us to get across Hecate Strait. Then we landed in Masset, about halfway up between the islands. I well remember the airfield there. There were several planes parked there, including a commercial passenger jet that looked much too big for its setting. We got picked up by a shuttle bus, which drove us to the lodgings we were to stay for the night. We got a dinner there, and afterwards went for a walk along a country road that seemed to go nowhere. But it did lead somewhere. It led to an old cemetery, the cemetery of the white settlers who had come there in the 19th century. There they had died, and the road led no further. They were buried in the graves, not far from the shore. The next morning we left. I remembered the feeling of desolation as we left from Masset Airport, looking out across the Dixon entrance, again to the northernmost island. We had a feeling we wouldn't be back. We flew back on our seaplane to Prince Rupert over the shining waves of Hecate Strait. Then, in the morning time, we provisioned and set forth for Alaska and Juneau to the north. As we flew along the coast during the day, the sun shone on us for much of the time. As the sun set in the west and the shadows got longer, Nick turned to me and said, "Turlough, I've wanted to tell you of what's been happening to me. This is just between the two of us. Dagmar doesn't know about it." He paused for a while, making an effort. Then he said, "In the past couple of years, I've been losing my skills. I don't fly as well as I used to. I don't mind telling you, I've had a couple of near misses." "Aye?" I told him. "I've noticed that you're not as sure of yourself behind the wheel as you used to be when I flew with you first." I paused, wondering what this was leading up to. "So, what do you want to tell me?" "Just this," he said. "I'm at the end of the line. I can't keep on flying. And I wanted to tell you because I've sensed that you're dealing with the same thing." I looked across at him. "So, what do you mean?" I asked. "What are you driving at exactly?" This time he looked me straight in the eyes. "When I was in Switzerland with Dagmar and met you then, I sensed how much of a shock it was for you that plane went down in the Alps, that Ju-52. I mean, it wasn't just a lucky escape. It was a warning to you. It was telling you that it had been your turn, and you just missed it. Going down with that whole crew, I mean." "You mean," I said, forcing myself to get the words out, "that it was my turn to go down with that plane, and somehow I missed it?" He nodded. "Yeah," he said, And now, that's why you've come on this trip. To finish it off, I said, feeling helplessly frank all of a sudden. Yeah, Nick said again. This time, we both go down. Is that it? I asked. Looks like it, he said gruffly. We've come all the way up here, and we're not going back. Is that how you read it? Yeah, he said. Don't you read it that way too? I mean, about the plane that's been stalking us since we got up here? I looked at him with a sudden stroke of recognition. You mean the Tante Ju? I said. He nodded again. Every so often I look behind me, and it's following us. It is us. I look over my shoulder from the cockpit, and it's not the cabin of a twin otter I see. It's a Tante Ju. A Tante Ju flying empty. We're flying it. It's come all the way here to go down with us. That's how I'm reading it. Automatically, helplessly, I looked over my shoulder. He was right. It wasn't the small, neat cabin of the twin otter I was seeing behind me, but the fuselage of a Tante Ju. I had never actually been in one, but of course I knew it well from photographs and films. I knew the Tante Ju when it was full of German business people in the 1930s, when Hugo Junkers first put them in the air. I knew them when Speer flew in them, when Hitler himself flew in them. So what do we do? I asked. What is it telling us? I figure it's come all the way here to go down again. To go down with us this time. I don't know if that is the way it's going to happen exactly. But the plane is here, and we are here, and it's looking just like it. Nick swallowed hard. It's telling us we're going down, Turlough, he said. All alone up here. I say we take the opportunity. Somewhere, if we keep flying in the darkness, it's going to take us down with it. Crashing into the side of a mountain on one of these coastal islands. Simple as that. I say go with it. We'll just go down together. No one will ever know how it really happened. What do you say? He looked across at me. I dare say it's like Saint-Exupéry when he made his last flight, I said after a while. Across the Mediterranean and up the Rhone Valley. He knew it was the last time. The last day of the month, his last day in the air. Nick nodded. The very last time, he said. I nodded in return. If the truth were told, I've been thinking this way too since we started out, I replied. Let's go down then, like this. Just the two of us, if this is the way it has to be. We flew on without another word, hugging the Pacific coast, wrapped now in silence, the silence of the secret we shared. We were often flying between an offshore island and part of the Pacific coast. It made a valley for us. The glistening water of the bay was for us the bottom of the valley. Misty clouds hugged the sides of the mountains. We felt we could plunge into them any time and hit the slope. Now began the long hours of waiting. At times Nick fell asleep and I was left alone at the controls. I would turn and look over my shoulder, and I'd see the empty fuselage of a Tante Ju, looking like it was stripped of ornament and 80 years old. I would get up and walk in there, and there it was, with nothing in it but the empty seats with their empty seat belts. I would walk up and down in the gloomy light of the cabin. At other times, I'd look back there and see a whole complement of passengers and crew in the seats. There were people in plain clothes, and there were people in field grey Wehrmacht uniforms. They would sit in their seats and look back at me, seemingly preoccupied with the trip they were taking. I'd look among them, and I fancied that I saw the face of Speer, or maybe Hitler himself, looking back at me. They might be over Poland, the Ukraine, or Russia. There might be nothing below us but a snow-covered winter desert. When I resumed my seat beside Nick Boudreau, he would turn and look at me. He would say nothing. There was nothing really to say. He knew the scene that awaited back there in the cabin. After a while, he'd step groggily to his feet and take a few steps backwards. I knew he was seeing the same things as I was. He was seeing either an empty cabin of a Tante Ju or a cabin full of passengers. He didn't know who they were, but they looked at him and he looked at them. Then, without another word, he would return to the cockpit and his seat beside me. He looked helplessly at me and out the windscreen, ahead of the plane, and down into the darkness. The plane made its solitary way on through the night. I seemed to hear only the rumble of engines in all the emptiness of the Pacific. At times, though, I felt we were not there, but were on the ground. We were lying in hospital beds, still hearing the sound of engines all around us. There were planes passing over us in the darkness. I felt completely numb. Or perhaps we were lying in a hospital morgue, still hearing the engines. In that case, we must be dead, we and the crew and the passengers. Then we would appear back at our posts in the cockpit of the seaplane. And so the phantom plane travelled on through the Pacific night, all alone, on its doomed voyage to Alaska. You have been listening to Last Night, Last Flight by Turlough Conmee from Weird Tales Told by a Dubliner. And this is the last in the last series. So good luck to you.